Okay, thanks very much. So as the title of this presentation suggests, I'm going to speak a little bit about the ways in which identity and visual culture are mediated through the prism of contemporary politics and society. I'm going to use Qatar as an example. I'm going to look at some of the ways in which visual culture is often sculpted towards a particular ideal, and we're going to examine some of the reasons why that happens. So much of Qatar's visual culture is deliberately marketed as having quite a deep history, and this helps create a sense of connection with the past, and it fosters ideas of continuity and permanence. And archaeological data and archaeologists themselves are often co-opted into a sort of idealised and in a political way into this process. So what I'm going to try and show is how politics, nationalism, archaeology and visual culture are all kind of entwined and complicit in the construction of a national identity, and use Qatar as an example of that. So a bit of background. Qatar gained independence from the British in September 1971, and since then two parallel phenomena have been in operation there. On the one hand, the population has expanded enormously, mainly due to immigration from outside of the Gulf, and on the other hand, the population has become focused on a single city, on Doha, the capital, rather than being dispersed into tribal territories as it was previously. So the process of forging a national identity accelerated from the 1970s onwards, in parallel with those social changes. And in this context, the engineering of a visual culture can be seen as a response to an influx of lots of cultural influences, ideas, beliefs and images from elsewhere. So we make the argument that it can also be regarded as an attempt to stabilise a rapidly changing cultural identity by means of the creation of a shared visual culture, and also by embedding the belief that visual culture has a long history. These processes aren't unique to Qatar, but Qatar is I think it's really instructive because these things are going on very rapidly. It's very visible, and a lot of this stuff has happened within the last 50 or 60 years, and so it's been recorded and it's very, very visible. So I want to focus on two key vehicles of visual culture in Qatar. One is vernacular architecture, and the other is the sort of suite of visual motifs that's associated with the country's Bedouin heritage and history. So I'm going to quickly run through some examples of how architecture is used to transmit ideas about the past, and look at vernacular architecture as presented today and how that compares with archaeological evidence. And then I'm going to discuss some of the ways that Bedouin visual culture has been appropriated into modern urban settled contexts, and how the depiction of and meanings associated with Bedouin culture have altered over time. I'm going to illustrate this with a short film, which I hope doesn't send too many people to sleep. I'm going to be a little bit indulgent and just let the film kind of run out and speak for itself, and then say a little bit more after that. And then I'll conclude with a few remarks from more kind of archaeological points of view. So I don't know if anybody here has ever been to Qatar, but the obvious place to start with a discussion on Qatari vernacular architecture is with SOUQ WAQIE, which is the central souk. It's a vibrant and very much visited cultural hub. It's used by Qataris and non-Qataris alike. It was shortlisted for the Aga Khan Award for Architecture in 2008. And the Aga Khan website contrasts SOUQ WAQIE with what it calls the heritage theme parks, which have become really characteristic of the souks elsewhere in the Gulf region. So the souk in Doha was clearly built with this kind of awareness of issues about heritage presentation. Despite this, the souk is effectively presented to visitors as historic, but it is effectively a reconstruction. Virtually everything you can see is reconstructed, mainly within the last kind of 20 or 30 years. So the souk combines some traditional construction methods with modern materials, and in doing so produces a result which is stylistically distinct from any of the surviving historic vernacular architecture. And in fact, much of the surviving historic urban fabric is being demolished to make way for the expansion of the souk, alongside a number of other flagship developments as well. So another example of a prestigious urban development in central Doha is the MSHEIREB project. And this is a development in downtown Doha
which takes up an entire city block, the construction of which involved the whole-scale demolition of one of Qatar's few kind of surviving historic quarters. So the MSHEIREB website states, it says the MSHEIREB project will blend traditional Qatari heritage and aesthetics with modern technology to create buildings of a shared DNA, reviving local heritage and culture through a unified architectural idiom. But what does this actually mean? Well, the process is often resulting in a homogenization of a diverse local history. And often the variety of architectural and stylistic elements which characterised pre-oil Doha, so pre-s of the 1940s Doha, are being reduced to a few emblematic motifs which are purported to be representative of a long-standing national aesthetic, which I argue is kind of invented. So a component of the MSHEIREB project involved the restoration and the conservation of a few select buildings as museums, and is meant to exemplify the local historic vernacular. Among these is the WAQIE house, which you can see on the top left, more clearly there, which is a large residential building which the MSHEIREB's museums site claims dates from 1906. The building is presented today as a single phase dwelling, furnished in a style intended to reflect lifestyle of the early 20th century. The Radwani House is among very few examples in Qatar where archaeological work has accompanied a heritage reconstruction project. So what you can see here are some of the images from the 2013 excavations that I participated in with UCL Qatar. And these excavations revealed that much of the standing fabric of the house in fact postdates the original 1906 building. Shouldn't really be that surprising, I suppose. But the picture which emerges from the archaeological evidence is far more complex than that presented at MSHEIREB. Reveals lots of phases of construction. And really the building that they have on display is completely reconfigured, virtually from the ground up, and basically reconstructed since about 2003. So what's the point of this? Am I just criticising contemporary takes on traditional buildings for the sake of it? I think not. I think by deliberately aiming at a generic architectural style that lacks the variety and the diversity of the few surviving pre-oil buildings, these projects have created a sort of central hub which presents a deliberately national style, and there wasn't, I argue, a national style previous to this. And this effaces a lot of the variety that characterised Doha in the past. This is a strategy aimed at national cohesion. It's taking a previously quite fractured and tribal society and creating a national visual culture identity and imposing that on the capital city, Doha. Meanwhile, the actual vernacular is being demolished to make way for this reconstruction. So in parallel with the processes that I've just described, there's a tendency to transpose elements of Bedouin visual culture into modern settled contexts. And as with the example of vernacular architecture, this tends towards an idealised, generic conception of Bedouin lifeways. And some examples of this include the use of tents and tent-like buildings as majlis, as you can see I think on the bottom, the central photo. There's a meeting space, usually adjoining houses, and the monumentalisation of Bedouin objects like coffee-making paraphernalia. And there's a nice example of a roundabout there that's a shape of a coffee pot. Also, use of traditional dress in official occasions like National Day, and the performance of traditional Bedouin activities like dance and falconry and things like that. So I'd like to just show a short film to illustrate some of these points. This is a collection that I edited down of clips from three sources. One is an ethnographic documentary from the late 1950s called Bedouin, which formed a counterpart to a big ethnographic text on Qatar. And the following two are, one is called Desert Caravan, the other is called Al Gael, but they're both basically televised modern takes on Bedouin life, and they're kind of competitive shows that are quite popular in Qatar. So I'm going to see if this video works. I do.
Mændene hjælper til med noget af dette arbejde, men snart er de i gang med at lave kaffe. Det flade brød bages på panden. Det fremstilles af hvedemel. Men beduinerne dyrker ikke korn. Det må de skærpe sig ved at handle med oasernes bønder eller fra byerne. Det gælder mange af de ting, de bruger, at de må købes eller tilbydes. Kedler, kammer, gryder og kopper. Kvinderne spinder kamelernes uld og væver den.
Where the use of music changes from one film to another as well, what they're clearing.
اليوم الثالث من الصيد وصل لنهايته والحكام بدأوا جولة سريعة يتفقدون الفرق المشاركة، وتمنى الحكام لكل فريق حظ أوفر في اليوم التالي، لكن عندهم بعض التوقعات.
Okay, hope that wasn't too loud. So some elements clearly stand out with the contrast between Jettabang's documentary and the TV shows. Tribal and regional differences, including clothing, seem to become swallowed up by a larger nationalist visual identity. What about the role of women in the last two films? You know, the erection and dismantling of tents, cooking, butter churning, weaving, they're all lost in this kind of recontextualised narrative of Bedouin life. Similarly for children and the elderly, their roles are much less visible. So the recent films are framed in terms of challenges and contests with a strong male bias in the people and the activities that are depicted. So Bedouin heritage in this way is repurposed as entertainment, and the idealised and commodified version of Bedouin culture which emerges emphasises stereotypically male pursuits like hunting, very much to the detriment of other activities. So some reasons for this recontextualisation have been suggested by Karen Excel and Trinidad Rico. I apologise for the slightly long quote, but it does kind of convey quite a lot of what we were thinking. They say, a national heritage industry has emerged as a result of a need to perform uniquely Arabian cultural expression. Performances presented in the emerging academic literature as forming part of invented traditions, aimed at embedding authenticity in the modern nation state. Ethnographically informed work has focused, for example, on the revival of authentic regional practices such as camel racing and poetry, falconry and pearl diving, as well as performances of dance, music and storytelling. So the Bedouin is a key interlocutor in the heritage imaginations of the region, as they represent the stakeholders of legitimate ancestries through the heritage representation of the Bedouin as a single group from the past ignores tribal and ethnic differences. So a few marks to conclude. Qatar is a very visible instance of the way in which visual culture and archaeological data are co-opted into an aesthetic ideal for the purpose of advancing national cohesion. This process results in a collective perception of a past which is markedly different to the picture which emerges from archaeological evidence and also ethnographic evidence. This one function of this phenomenon is to reinforce the legitimacy of political elites. In the case of Qatar, the construction of a single coherent historic visual culture effaces diverse and potentially intractable tribal histories that may challenge the ruling Al-Thani dominance. And this is key. Through creating the illusion of a single, unified and unchanging visual culture, the persistence of political elite is reinforced and kept static. Archaeologists, curators and others are complicit in this process. As museums, archaeological missions, film and television are all vehicles for the transmission of visual culture, and they've all largely been, in Qatar, outsourced to foreigners, mainly to Europeans. In a sense, this process markets a static depiction of Qatari history back to a society which has always actually been diverse and pluralistic. This raises some difficult questions for academics from the Western tradition who operate in these kinds of environments. Is it appropriate for non-Qataris to take such a prominent role in shaping Qatari visual culture? What elements are they missing or misunderstanding? Can and should archaeologists seek to influence the narrative into which visual culture feeds? And are archaeologists complicit in the commoditisation of Bedouin culture? I hope that if we haven't answered, we've at least succeeded in highlighting a few of these questions. So Exile and Rico again argue that there are multi-layered heritages and identities which are intricately woven into the Qatari state and may not be visible to non-Qataris. Some approaches archaeologists could take to mitigate for these problems are things like increasing the prominence and diversity of oral histories, to enhance the plurality of views and perspectives on visual culture that are accessible to people, emphasising the documentation and the diversity of visual culture, and just having a greater awareness of the politicised nature of images and visual culture more generally. So to return to the theme of this session, how to see time. In the context of Qatar, we can see how time and visual culture are entwined and both mediated through the lens of political forces and external pressures resulting from the influx of people since the 1960s. When we look at Qatari visual culture, we see a combination of historic, imagined and transformed motifs, all reflected through the lens of contemporary politics. And Jonathan Rabban, in his 1979 book entitled Arabia Through the Looking Glass, wrote of Doha, I love this quote, "Objects, people, clothes, traditions and technologies were swirling about in an unholy stew. Nothing matched, everything grated against everything else. I tried to look at it as a Qatari might. There was hardly a Qatari to be seen. The few I did spot were in their cars, their palms locked solid on their horns, hooting good-naturedly through the multicoloured, multilingual mob who had taken over their city. No wonder the Qataris needed to remind themselves of who they were." And the title of Rabban's book brings me neatly back to the theme of this presentation, because time and visual culture are indeed perceived through an opaque lens of politics, nationalism, identity and memory. Thank you very much.